Hello everyone. In this video, I'll talk about the Hesiodic Cosmogony or Hesiodic Theogony rather, and we'll discuss whether this theogony constitutes a cosmogony in the first place, and second, how that could function as a kind of proto-philosophical or pre-philosophical rather cosmogony, and how that might have influenced some of the philosophers, well, in the sense that they tried to overcome some of the problems that remained in it, even though it is a cosmogony, but like the problems that remained, and it did not make it a proper cosmology per se. Okay. So, as we already talked about in the earlier sort of videos, what Hesiod attempted was a systematization of ancient myths. In his theogony, which is a poetical cosmogony of a sort, he tried to trace back the ancestry of the gods to the beginning of the world, right? And this was an attempt to synthesize earlier variant accounts with some inconsistencies to make it into a proper sort of cosmogony of the world, which could then be or theogony, which could then explain the origin of the gods, and which could then sort of explain the current world order. And we already talked about the role of religion, of gods, and its relation to the human world order, and how it in some ways reflects the human world order, but also justifies it, the order of ranks, of class, how religion and these myths sort of both sort of try to give an explanation to what could potentially and correctly, I would say, be seen as an extremely unfair ordering of the world, at least politically, and try and justify it. So here again, there's a twofold attempt to first give a kind of natural physical cosmogony, but also a political sort of explanation of order. Right, so I'll read out a bit of this apart from theogony, which will then give us an idea of what kind of work was Hesiod doing in there. I'll read a different translation because that's a prose translation. So not that, when I read it out, you could tell whether it's prose or not. So, first of all, chaos came into being. Next came broad-breasted Gaia, the secure dwelling place forever of all, the immortals who hold the peak of snowy Olympus, and murky Tartarus in a recess of broad-breasted earth, and Eros, who is the most beautiful amongst the immortal gods, who loosens the limbs and overpowers the intentions and sensible plans of all the gods and all humans too. From chaos, there came into being Erebos and Black Night. From night, Aether and Hemere came into being. By the way, if you want explanation of all of them, so Gaia is earth, Tartaros is the underworld, Eros is love, chaos we'll discuss. Aether is the sort of, we discussed it already, that this bright upper air, and Erebos is darkness, and Hemere is day. Right, we were at the end of Hemere, right? From night, Aether and Hemere came into being, which she conceived and bore after uniting in love with Erebos. Gaia first brought forth starry Uranos, that is heaven, equal to herself, to cover her all about in order to be a secure dwelling place forever for the blessed gods. She brought forth long mountains, beautiful shelters of divine nymphs who lived in wooded mountains, and also, without love that is, gave birth to the barren sea, Pontos, raging with its swelling waves. Then, bedded by Uranos, She gave birth to deep swirling ocean, and Koios and Kreios and Hyperion and Iapetos and Theia and Rhea and Themis and Mnemosyne and Phoebe with her golden wreath and lovely Tethys. So the titans. And here you notice that Okeanos and Tethys now are not the origin of all, but they are given birth to by Gaia, right? By herself, without Uranos. And after them, last of all, was born crafty-minded Kronos, and Kronos is time, and we'll come back to this. Kronos is pretty important. The most terrible of the children, and he hated his mighty father, and this hatred of the mighty father we'll come back to. So, with this, and we'll discuss this passage further, we are already, we can see this kind of both the systematization of myth, so you can see, a kind of genealogy of the gods as being produced, that, this one was the father, and this one was the child, and this is how this one was produced. And a chronology is produced, though Kronos comes at the end. And we'll see how it also creates a sort of, there's a story to this as well. I know it's not as much fun as reading the Iliad or the Odyssey, which is like a proper narrative, but here as well, there is a kind of story of the gods that is being told, a kind of family history in some way, the family history of the gods. And what does the history of the gods tell us about the current constitution of the world, natural and political? Both of them are part of this. So, let's just focus first on the first line. First of all, chaos came into being. Now, what is this chaos? So Aristotle later tried to explain it as infinite space or infinite place, but that is already a bit anachronistic. The idea of chaos being understood as infinite space or place. The idea of it being this kind of a disordered, shapeless matter from which things emerge is even later. So where does this chaos, the word, come from? It comes from the word kha. In fact, you have this word even in Sanskrit, kha, khana, the word kha or khai, in fact, if you think of it that way. So all these words, the word kha actually means a gap. It could also mean a yawn, like a gaping mouth, a gaping jaw. And with the idea of the gaping jaw, you have the idea of a vast gulf, chasm. In fact, the translation that I have out here, which I didn't read, in this one, he translates it as chasm, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, he says, first came chasm, and then broad-breasted earth. So which is a more precise translation, because the problem with chaos, the word chaos has traveled to English, but the meaning of chaos has changed in English. While in Greek, it's the idea is of something like a mouth, right? Khanos is a mouth, right? Of an opening, gaping mouth, and in this opening mouth, what do you notice? What do you see if you come very close? Try and don't do it to my mouth, but if you open your mouth and take a picture of it or take a video of it, and then you focus on it, it's pretty horrifying, right? It's this gulf, this abyss, this infinite darkness, but it's still like a contained infinite darkness which opens into this kind of a dark space. Right, so this idea of chaos, which came first, is a very interesting idea, and we'll discuss this even more right now. But it later on, in the same poem, in Hesiod, sort of the chaos could actually be, a part of Tartaros, part of the underworld, or whole of the underworld. Or it could be the region between earth and aether, because it's a gap that signifies boundaries. And in fact, it's very interesting to see what this chaos from which everything came to be, first came chaos, it's a big statement, what this chaos could possibly be, right? So this chaos as a gap could also be something that signifies, because if you notice, in first came chaos, and you have Gaia and Uranos, right, the earth and the sky. And I'll read out a later passage in which it's about the copulation of Uranos and Gaia, from which everything is created. And there was this belief at that time, and you can see it as a naturalistic belief of the rain from the sky fertilizing the earth, sort of slightly crudely sexual kind of an imagination of like the rain as being like a fertilization, and then from the earth, then different things emerging, a kind of reproductive element, but like the rain coming from the sky. So the idea of this earth and a sky. Now, if the earth and the sky are one, so what is shifting here is that instead of it being a kind of asexual reproduction, what in the theogony, what Hesiod is doing is shifting it towards a sexual reproduction. But for the sexual reproduction, you need two, right? You need two. It has to be a bi-gendered, bisexual in that sense, gap, which means that this gap. What chaos is chaos can signify the separation of the earth and the sky, the separation of Gaia and Uranos. And so, we could think of it, first came chaos, first came gap or the chasm, and Cornford, as Kirk and Raven sort of point out, had the interpretation that the first came the chaos between earth and sky. We can add these two words, So first came chaos, and so what chaos is doing is it's creating a differentiated world. So if the world was like one single mass, undifferentiated, what chaos did, so the chaos is not the undifferentiated mass. Rather, chaos is the creation of the gap which makes that undifferentiated mass into a differentiated and structured mass. And that's the beginning of cosmos, right? From chaos came cosmos, is the idea that from an undifferentiated mass came differentiation and order. So this is actually a philosophical theme, and in fact, when we do an Anaximander, we will actually be looking at the creation of a cosmos from apeiron, boundaryless matter, like borderless matter. And this creation of apeiron in Anaximander, is a creation of gap. Right, things get separated out. In fact, also you will see in Empedocles, you have love and strife. So what love is trying to attract things together, and strife, which is trying to sort of push things away, reject things. And it's from there that creation happens. So the idea of creation as being an idea of differentiation. So this you can already see in Hesiod, if this is how we understand chaos, which is the gap, right? So the idea of this gap creating this differentiation. And in fact, later on, Tartaros is sort of described as this chasma mega. The word chasma comes in, from which comes chasm, actually. So this great chasm, right? And what is this great chasm? This great chasm is full of storms, and it's night and gloomy. And why is it stormy? I suppose it's because it's night, it's dark, right? It's abyss. Now, when you look into the mouth in a gap, it's not necessarily going to be stormy, but I suppose, you've read so many stories where you have, it was a dark and stormy night, it was dark and silent night. Well, you have silent night as well, but think of it as stormy night, right? And chaos produces erebos and night, so both are dark, gloomy things, so it's a production of darkness. And so what you have with Hesiod is this formation of a differentiated world by the production of this chaos, this vast gap between earth and sky. This gap is dark and windy. Why? One of the reasons is because, the aether and sun haven't come to be, they come after, right? So the first things produced are actually erebos and night. And this Tartaros, which, was there in Homer as well, and which continues to be there, is this kind of a lightless gulf. The abyss is Tartaros. And this Tartaros could be part of the original chaos. In fact, it's another thing differentiated from the chaos. The gap then differentiates and creates one section called the Tartaros, which is the more dark and gloomy part of it. And then you have the Uranos, which is a bright and solid and shiny part of it, which is full of aether, but also air, right? So it is like it has air and mist and everything in there. So what you have here in the Theogony is this kind of a crude account, really, I would say, of the copulation of the earth and the sky and the separation of the earth and the sky. And the next step that you would see is that there is a castration myth, right? There is a myth of succession of the gods, which is explained via a kind of castration myth. And Freud would have made much of it, of course, and he did make much of it. But I think we could also look to Hegel to understand this as a kind of, overcoming by killing, by castrating, by destroying the previous sort of order to create a new order. So the idea of succession, which comes with castration. And I'll read that section for you as well. Give me a second. So yes, so this is from Hesiod's Theogony, line 154, thereabouts. So, all who came forth from Gaia and Uranos, the most dire of children, from the beginning were hated by their own begetter. So you can see this father who hates the children, right? Why does he hate the children? Rightly so, because they are it's possible, and they do, overthrow him, right? So if he wants his rule to continue, he doesn't want to have children in that sense, but they happen. And just as soon as any of them came into being, he hid them all away and did not let them into the light in the inward places of Gaia, right? So what is he doing? As soon as they are born, he hides them inside Gaia, right? And Uranos rejoiced over this evil deed. Of course, he rejoices because, that's exactly what he wants to do. And she, prodigious Gaia, groaned within, for she was crowded out, and she contrived a crafty evil device. So, because all these things that are being born in Gaia, he's not letting them come out, he's like pushing them inside. She's not happy about it. So she sent him Kronos, and remember Kronos was the youngest, time. And it's very interesting that time comes at the end, which means that all the others before were before time, before time came into sort of the picture. So she sent time, or Kronos, into a hidden place of ambush, placed in his hand a jagged-toothed sickle, and enjoined him the whole deceit. Great Uranos came bringing night with him, and over Gaia, desiring love, he stretched himself and spread all over her. And he, his son, from his place of ambush, stretched out with his left hand, and with his right he grasped the monstrous sickle, long and jagged-toothed, and swiftly sheared off the genitals of his dear father, and flung them behind him, to be carried away. Like, pretty horrible, sorry. I will not go, you can imagine the details anyway. So what's going on? It's like a very clear castration myth, right? The idea that time is taking over, right? And how is he ending the previous rule without time in that sense, because time was hidden away, is by, literally castrating the father. And as you can imagine, Freud made a lot of this. But we can also think about it in a Hegelian sense. And in the Hegelian sense, what is going on is that there is a Aufhebung, there's a sublation of the previous order into the new one, like from, without time, or time being implicit and hidden, now time becomes like explicit and present. And there is a new order with time at its head. Yeah? And this also sort of explains, Uranos' separation with Gaia, but also Uranos' copulation with Gaia, right? It's a very crude sexual myth there as well. But in addition to that, there is also a sort of, crude castration myth, which then ends the previous rule in some ways to start a new rule. And this kind of a myth creates a kind of myth of the succession of gods, yeah, and in that sense a birth of order. So if you have a question about, is this a cosmogony? What is a cosmogony? Cosmos is sort of order. As I said, order, beautiful order, structure, and goni, birth, right? So it does give an account of a birth of world order in that sense. And you can see this very strong belief here that the world is ordered, it's a cosmos, it is structured. Yes, well, unlike in the later philosophers, the divinity here is anthropomorphic, and that's why it is arbitrary, because humans are arbitrary in many ways, so the divinity is also arbitrary. But there is an attempt to find a naturalistic order. If you think about the order in which things happen, so you have, you have in the beginning, you have, chaos, which separates out Gaia and Uranos. And so you have the earth and the sky appear. And then you have Erebos and Nukes. So you have all the night and darkness, which then go below into Tartarus. Tartarus appears. These are places on Earth as well. You have Pontos that appeared, that was a sea, which is different from Okeanos, ocean, who is one of the titans. So Okeanos and Tethys are one of the titans. You have Kronos and Rhea, the next two important titans, the rulers, because Kronos is the one who takes over, youngest son, time, but also the one who takes over. And so you have an attempt to explain the physical history and the composition of the world, really, the astronomical, the meteorological, the geographical. And so if you think about, there's all the names as well, Gaia, Uranos, Tartaros, like earth, sky, underworld, under the earth. For Hesiod, what you have is, you have a natural world which is really full of gods. You have gods everywhere. It's a natural world full of gods. And there is a chronology, a very strong chronology that you can find. So you have the origin of the early divinities, you have Gaia and Uranos, then you have the birth of the Titans, which is, and the last of whom were Kronos and Rhea. Kronos sort of castrates Uranos and takes over, and Rhea, who is the flow, right? You have time, but you also have the flow, Rhea, of time, the ease of time, so they take over, who give birth then to the Olympian gods, whom you're more familiar with. And the Olympians, and you can read the Hesiod and see the myth, they also, I'm doing a very quick summary, they defeat the Titans. And with the defeat of the Titans, there's a closing of Tartarus, because remember, Tartarus is still open before, so new things are emerging from there. There's a closing of Tartarus, and with the closing of Tartarus, you have a fixing of order. Like so far, order was still in Rhea, right? Panta Rei, it was in flux, right? It was being changed. And now what you have is, with the defeat of the Titans, closing of Tartarus, you have a fixing of order, fixing of rank, fixing of privileges. And Zeus, who is the one who takes over at the end of the thing, Zeus, Deus, and we talked about Deus Piter, Jupiter, who swallows his consort at that time, Metis, who was counsel. Metis is counsel or wisdom. He swallows wisdom. Now, what comes out of swallowing wisdom? Like, well, the positive reading of it is that he receives all her attributes. He imbibes her. Like, this is really, really sort of Hegelian. He sort of imbibes her and sublates her so that he becomes the sort of wise god. But also Hegelian. By imbibing her, he can rule, and in some ways he can rule perpetually, because if he has all the counsel and wisdom, and he is, and what would counsel and wisdom do? Would also question him. Nobody, to question him is to put yourself in danger, really. Trying to send him to sleep, as we saw in the previous video, Hypnos was threatened with being thrown into Tartarus. So he can then rule perpetually. Right? So if you think about the lines that I had just read, it begins with theogonic myths, right? It begins with the birth of the gods and ends with the first struggle. It ends with, Kronos sort of castrating Uranos. So it ends with the first struggle for mastery. And if you notice, there's not just nature that is being talked about. You also have the natural, you also have love, you have memory, you have sleep, you have deceit, peace later on. In some ways, what is happening out here is that what Hesiod is doing is anthropomorphizing the gods, because he's bringing in sexual reproduction out there. You could also think of it as zoologizing the gods, because animals too have that. But yeah, so he's making gods kind of zoological in that sense phenomena, and he's using parentage, parentage as a device for ordering the world. And with this order, then he can also now, like he now has a cosmogony, and I think we can well establish that even though it's not a cosmogony that we are all very happy with necessarily, but it is a cosmogony, right? It's a birth of order, a birth of structure. He also then starts to create a picture of the cosmos, which we already had more or less from Homer. We discussed this, but I'll just read out the section again from Hesiod, where he talks about the kind of order that we can find. So this is line 720. as far beneath earth as heaven is from earth, for that is the distance from earth to murky Tartarus, which is pretty much what we talked about in Homer. For a bronze anvil falling 9 days and night from heaven would reach earth on the 10th. And a bronze anvil falling 9 days and nights from earth would reach Tartarus on the 10th. Around Tartarus, a fence of bronze has been built. Night is poured round its throat in 3 layers. Above it grow the roots of earth and the barren sea. There the Titans are hidden away beneath the murky darkness through the plans of cloud-gathering Zeus in a dark place at the ends of the huge earth. They have no way out, since Poseidon has set bronze doors upon it, and a wall runs in both directions. There are the sources and limits of dark earth and murky Tartarus, and the barren sea and starry heaven, one after the next, unpleasant and dank, and the gods loathe them. It is a huge chasm, and not within an entire complete year would a person reach its floor if he first came to be within its gates. But gust after hard gust would bring him this way and that. Skipping a few lines. And the dread house of dark night stands covered in black clouds. In front of these things, the son of Iapetos, which is Atlas, stands and holds the broad heaven on his head and tireless arms without moving. When night and day draw near and greet each other as they cross the great threshold of bronze, the one will descend while the other goes out, and the chamber never contains both at once, but one is always outside, wandering over the earth while the other is within and waits for the time of her own journey to arrive. The one holds far-seeing light for those who live on the earth, while deadly night holds in her hand sleep, brother of death, and is covered in murky clouds, so that is sleep. There the children of black night have their home, sleep and death, dreadful gods. Nor does shining Helios ever look upon them with his rays as he ascends the heaven or as he descends from heaven. Yeah, sorry, long passage. And I'll promise the next one is very short, so I would not read, too many passages for you. So we have, again, from these lines, a picture of the cosmos. Right? It's not a very coherent description, as you would have noticed, but the size and the structure of it become more evident. You can imagine now, this heaven on top. You can still imagine it as a hemisphere. The gap between Uranus and Gaia, Earth, which is again flat, and you have the ocean around, on which the sun travels. We've already talked about that. You have the gate now of Tartarus. So below is Tartarus. Now Tartarus, the chaos chasm, now things are getting a bit sort of murky out there. It is murky. You have the gates from which day and night sort of alternate. And so you have a kind of cosmology as well, not a very good one, but you have something. You can't draw a map on it and travel the world, but you have a picture of the world now, and he's trying to systematize it. Rather than just thinking it is evident, there is an attempt to systematization. So what exactly is Hesiod doing? What he's doing is he's trying to create a history of the world from its origins to the present, and he's looking towards the future. And he's also trying to give us a structure of the world, an order of the world. And this world is ruled by Olympians now, and ruled by the Olympians, it is now a well-ordered cosmos, and it's now fixed in many ways with the Olympians ruling, and is governed by principles that we as humans can understand. Well, a lot of it is power, and we also know that it is power that gets the gods into this sort of position. So the gods are also historicized in that sense, right? The power that the gods have is they get it by force. There is some kind of an acceptance. I think all the Olympians decide together in some ways that, okay, Zeus better be the king, kind of a thing. So, this kind of a nomination election kind of a thing, but really it is more about, who overthrew the previous order and who takes over and who is the strongest, who has a thunderbolt. Zeus is the one who has a thunderbolt, and with the thunderbolt he can threaten everybody. So he is the one who holds the position of power in this place. And so, this last thing that I would read, it's the question of administration. So this is line 881, where he says, "But when the blessed gods had completed their labor and decided by force the dispute about the Titans' powers and privileges," it is decision by force, then by the advice of Gaia, who is the mother, mother, right? They urged wide-seeing Olympian Zeus to be king and to rule whom? The immortals, and then later on the mortals when they come about. And that's another myth, we are not going into it right now. And he distributed well the powers and privileges amongst them. So Zeus is like, the kind of boss, really. And he's distributing powers and privileges, so that means he's delegating some of the work, and he's not taking all the power within himself. And so he makes an ordered cosmos, right? Poseidon has different powers, Hera has different powers, like you have all the different gods who are given different powers. And in fact, the problem is when they mess around. So for example, the whole Prometheus myth, Prometheus is one of the titans. So why was he punished, He was punished because he gave to mortals something that was not to be given to them. This is a power that should not have been shared. So just to conclude about this whole sort of, these 3 videos, fairly confusing, of the religion, the religious picture, poetry, myth, and science and cosmology, what kind of proto-science can you find in here? What kind of cosmology can you find in here? It's not very clear, it's not very systematic, but you can see where philosophy would have sprung from. This is the world, this is the world of ideas. We have not talked that much about the politics as yet. I mean, we have in another video where we talked about why in Miletus, for example, because they were, geographically located in such a place, Greek colonization had reached such a stage that they were comfortable enough, they didn't have to worry about the next meal. That's a more sort of, materialistic sort of explanation of the beginning of philosophy. But also the conceptual beginning of philosophy is, like these explanations were not enough. Good attempt, Hesiod, let's say, but we need something more systematic, more philosophical, more scientific, and this is what we would call the coeval beginning, what I've called, of philosophy and science, is in this world. And in a very Hegelian sense, it is simply something that is sublated, which means that these elements would remain. These elements remain till now. When I was just reading this, these 9 days, you will find it in the Christian myth, Milton's Paradise Lost, and which is very different, which is very Hesiodic actually. But nature, let's say, a naturalistic, animistic religion sublated into, myth and poetry, sublated into philosophy. It's too clean a picture. But there is some kind of a, the thing about sublation is that the old remains in the new. The sort of, the essence of the old is still there. There is some kind of a supersession that is being done, but there is no clear-cut division that you can do, and that is what is dialectics. What is dialectical about it is that there is no clear-cut division between the old and the new, between the religious, mythic, poetic, everyday sort of life of people versus the intellectual, philosophical, rational, logical, mathematical sort of ideas of Plato or Aristotle. And if you read Plato's Timaeus, where he's trying to explain the sort of structure of the world, and he has his own cosmogony and cosmology, myth. Poetry, So Plato, who talked about the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy and wanted to ban poets. And remember, by banning poets, he didn't mean ban verse, because he had the highest respect for Parmenides, but ban this kind of a very problematic, in Plato's view, vision of gods fighting and strife. And what kind of examples, think about it, what kind of example does it set, to think of Uranus and Kronos and Zeus. It's about castrating the father, killing the father. The father himself is a jealous and angry sort of father who hides the children inside. And it's not a very sort of nice story. And so Plato, in some ways rightly so, was not very happy about this being educative to the young. And I think, you know, there will be many amongst us who would agree with Plato on this. You know, censor board, like let's censor out, you know, some of these horrible myths, especially if these are created, if gods are taken as exemplary for humans. And we have already discussed that that's not necessarily the case, you know. I mean, humans don't follow God's example. Gods are these lords, you know, like in the same way as the common person was not supposed to follow Achilles and Agamemnon, you know, or to question them. In the same way, you know, we common humans weren't supposed to question. These are the myths are there to not to necessarily prescribe in the sense of, you know, the gods are not, you know, moral examples that we follow. Rather, they are powers that we can pray to and hope that they help us, you know. So you have all these, in fact, they're really interesting, the hymns to the early gods, you know. They are powers that would help us, but we don't emulate them, you know, because we don't have the same power, we don't have the same lives. So with Plato, it's a much more complex issue of like, what is he trying to ban? But yeah, the idea of like this quarrel between poetry and philosophy is that these things are going to confuse humans. If we want to have a just ordered republic, and you know, in the Republic, when he says that, you know, we want these out, he's not saying we want the gods per se out, but we want the Homeric and Hesiodic gods out. You know, Homer I have highest respect for, he says, but I will give him all the respect and him not in our city, go somewhere else. Why? Because these Homeric gods, as you can see, are, as far as Plato is concerned, way too chaotic, right? There's no cosmos in them, and he wants a cosmos. Here again, the cosmos is ordered, ranked. In Plato as well, you have, you know, a ranked class system. You have the philosopher kings on top, and you have below, you know, you have a structure. You have, you know, the warriors, and then you have the merchants and the farmers, and, you know, so there is a, you know, class, caste, you know, because it's not a class in the same sense in which Marx would use it, more of a caste structure. So, you know, like, but it's different from the one that you would see in Homer or Hesiod, right? It's a different idea of order and structure that he's trying to promote, and for that reason, he doesn't want this thing. So again, you know, we can have a very nice and clear picture of philosophy saying, well, you know, we need to be, at the very least, agnostic about the gods, you know, if possible atheistic, no gods, let's explain nature via nature, let's explain the world via the world. But the gods enter, you know. In Hesiod, the world is full of anthropomorphic gods, but then we'll see with the pre-Socratics, you know, what place does water have, or air have, or apeiron have, and then what happens later with Plato, we will not get there, but maybe in the last lesson we can talk about Plato's critique of materialism of the Ionians. So it was long and difficult, and I think this is the more difficult part of this course, is looking at, you know, the religion and myth and philosophy and poetry, because and it's impossible. I cannot do a good job in, you know, a couple of, you know, lectures and 1 hour or 90 minutes or how much ever this is, 70 minutes. But it's an extremely useful sort of, you know, background that we should keep in mind, you know, in the back of our mind when we sort of study the history of philosophy after this. Thank you.